Hello everyone, I know you watched this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. The case of Michelle O'Keefe. Who killed the aspiring actress? The judicial system, unfortunately, is not perfect, even in the most developed and democratic countries. Innocent people sometimes end up serving time for crimes they did not commit. A result of such injustices usually come to light only when the real culprit is found and proven guilty. But what happens when someone convicted of murder is exonerated years later, while the real perpetrator remains unpunished because crucial evidence was lost by the police at the time? The case of young American Michelle O'Keefe, killed under mysterious circumstances in the early 2000s, shook the nation. The investigation lasted several years until the main, and essentially the only suspect, was imprisoned for a significant term. It seemed the case was closed, but after 11 years in prison, the convicted person's innocence was proven. Simultaneously, new details emerged, and another suspect appeared, likely the real murderer. However, more than 2 decades since the student's murder, her parents have become disillusioned with justice, losing hope that the person who took their daughter's life will face fair punishment. Let's delve into this story from the beginning, and try to understand where the investigation went wrong, and whether these errors could have been avoided. Who is Michelle O'Keefe? Michelle Teresa O'Keefe was born on October 11, 1981 in the quiet town of Hanford, California. The eldest of 2 children born to Patricia and Michael O'Keefe, Michelle grew up alongside her younger brother, Jason. The O'Keefes were a well-off family, owning a profitable local store. Her parents were committed to ensuring their children received a quality education and could fully realize their talents and potential. Michelle was an exemplary student, excelled in sports and ballroom dancing, and was known for her attractive and artistic demeanor. She dreamed of becoming a famous actress, appearing in films and conquering Hollywood. She possessed the talent, ambition, and attributes necessary for such a feat. After graduating high school with honors, Michelle easily gained admission to one of California's prestigious colleges. She continued her passion for dancing and took evening acting classes. Michelle actively participated in various events, appeared in commercials, and was often seen as an extra in movie and music video shoots. On her 18th birthday, her loving parents gifted her a luxurious blue Ford Mustang with a new Edge design concept. Michelle had always dreamt of owning this car and was overjoyed to receive it as a present. Unfortunately, it was this striking vehicle that likely drew the attention of her killer, leading to the tragic demise of the young Michelle. The last shoot. On February 22, 2000, 18-year-old Michelle O'Keefe and her close friend Jennifer Peterson, also an aspiring actress, headed to Palmdale, a scenic town in Los Angeles County, for a video shoot. They were to appear in the latest music video by the popular rock musician Robert James Ritchie, better known by his stage name, Kid Rock. Jennifer and Michelle were extras, dancing and revealing outfits for the video. The shoot consumed nearly the entire day, so by the time they returned to their cars parked at a nearby amusement park, it had almost darkened. Jennifer planned to go home, but Michelle had acting classes that evening. The friends chatted in the parking lot for a few minutes before parting ways. Jennifer walked to her car, while Michelle decided to stay behind to change into her regular clothes. She felt it inappropriate to attend her acting classes in the same outfit she wore for the video shoot, as it was quite provocative. With nowhere private to change on the parking lot, and finding it awkward to do so in her car, Michelle opted to quickly change her clothes right there on the street next to her car, believing she was alone. This decision, unfortunately, likely proved to be a fatal mistake. Jennifer recalled lingering in the parking lot a while longer, chatting with her boyfriend on the phone. As she started to leave, she noticed the headlights of Michelle's Ford Mustang turning on. Believing Michelle was about to follow her, Jennifer felt reassured that her friend was safe. With loud music playing in her car, the last thing Jennifer saw before turning the corner was what she thought was Michelle's Mustang starting to back out. The murder of an aspiring actress. That evening, a young security guard named Raymond Lee Jennings was on duty at the park and its attractions. Around 9 o'clock, the 25-year-old heard sounds resembling gunshots emanating from the direction of the parking lot, followed by a car alarm. Lacking a firearm and equipped only with a taser, he hesitated to approach alone, knowing he stood little chance against armed assailants. Jennings promptly called his supervisor Iris Malone and reported the incident, also alerting the police. Malone arrived within minutes, so before law enforcement reached the scene, she and Jennings decided to cautiously inspect the situation at the parking lot. They immediately noticed a blue car backed out into the middle lane and halted there with its headlights on and engine running. This was Michelle's Ford Mustang. The car owner was in the driver's seat, motionless and showing no signs of life. Upon closer inspection, Malone and Jennings observed blood inside the car and on Michelle's body, along with several bullet wounds. The driver's door was wide open, and the crime scene appeared horrific. It seemed that Michelle had been chased and initially wounded in the parking lot. She had tried to escape, leapt into her car, and even managed to start it. But the assailant caught up to her and fired several more shots, depriving the student of any chance of survival. Michelle's appearance was quite provocative. She had bright makeup and a tousled hairstyle, styled specifically for the video shoot. She was also wearing regular jeans and a shiny top. Apparently, Michelle had partially changed in the parking lot as a shiny mini skirt matching the top and a regular t-shirt were found next to her on the passenger seat. One of her shoes was on her foot, while the other lay away on the parking lot, presumably dropped as she dashed to her car. Crime scene investigation. Following the security guard and his supervisor, the first to arrive at the crime scene was the local sheriff's deputy. He noted that the young woman showed no signs of life, but he informed emergency services in case he was mistaken and she still had a chance of being saved. He also recorded the statements of Jennings and Malone. The arriving police officers began a thorough examination of the crime scene, gathering all possible evidence. They found several shell casings on the parking lot and noticed a bullet mark on the asphalt, slightly away from the car. This led to the conclusion that the perpetrator likely first fired a shot into the ground to intimidate the victim, then shot at her directly, as evidenced by blood stains on the parking lot. The victim had run towards her car, but didn't manage to escape, as the assailant caught up to her and fired several more shots. She died almost instantly from extensive injuries and significant blood loss. In total, she was killed. 5 shell casings were found on the ground. Experts concluded that all shots were fired from the same weapon, but the bullets significantly differed from each other, raising questions that needed prompt answers. Also found on the ground was an earring, presumably dropped by the victim. Later, her friend identified this item, confirming it belonged to Michelle. However, the second earring was not found on or near the victim. This detail, unfortunately, was initially deemed insignificant, and was forgotten for a long time, which turned out to be a crucial oversight. Theories and speculations initially. Close relatives and friends of the murdered young woman were interviewed. They unanimously asserted that Michelle had no enemies or ill-wishers. Known for her sociable, open, and very friendly nature, everyone who knew her spoke highly of the student. Thus, a personal motive for the murder was almost immediately ruled out. The next theory considered was an unsuccessful robbery, or carjacking attempt of her new vehicle. However, this seemed doubtful. The only personal item missing was her mobile phone, which she had used just minutes before the attack to tell her mother that the filming was over and she was heading back. Michelle's purse, containing her wallet and a couple of $100 in cash, was found at the passenger's feet. Police speculated that in the confusion and darkness, the assailant might have failed to notice the purse, and fearing the gunshot sounds had attracted security, didn't search the car. This could also explain why the carjacking attempt was aborted. It seemed the attacker initially did not intend to shoot, but only to threaten her with the weapon, but something went wrong. Another theory proposed that Michelle might have been mistaken for a lady of the night due to her appearance. She was dressed provocatively with heavy makeup and high heels. It was possible the criminal noticed her on her way to the parking lot and followed her. In the darkness, he might have approached her with ill intentions, but upon being firmly rejected, he took her life in retaliation. Supporting this theory was the fact that her top was partially pulled down, exposing her left breast. This suggested that the attacker was likely a man. However, it was also possible that her thin, strapped clothing slipped during the scuffle, or as the frightened, wounded young woman attempted to get into her car. The sole suspect. The first person interrogated was Raymond, the security guard on duty at the parking lot, who was believed to be the sole witness of the incident. He confirmed hearing gunshots and a car alarm around 9 in the evening, immediately reporting it to his supervisor and calling the police. Raymond noted he saw no one on the parking lot before or after the shots. No one fled or left the scene in the minutes following. It's plausible that others nearby might have seen or heard something. Police became interested in Raymond's background and discovered that despite his relatively young age, he was the head of a large family raising 5 children. He served in the California National Guard and aspired to be a law enforcer working while also studying at the police academy, gaining certain knowledge and skills as the main witness to the murder. Raymond sought to help the investigation, naively thinking that this experience would be beneficial for his academy exams. When investigators asked him to present his version of events during an interrogation, Raymond detailed his perspective on how things might have unfolded. Being a top student, he meticulously considered all details, trying to piece together a coherent picture. He hypothesized where the attacker and victim might have been during the initial gunshot and how subsequent events unfolded. He based his story on the evidence, the location of shell casings, blood droplets, the victim's belongings, and the car. He also estimated the shooting distances. At that time, Raymond didn't realize that he was unwittingly digging his own grave. He just wanted to assist the investigation and be useful. However, the detectives investigating the case drew their own conclusions, suggesting that such detailed knowledge could only be possessed by the murderer himself. Since there were no other suspects, the security guard was charged with the girl's murder. New witnesses several weeks after Michelle's murder, a 17-year-old African-American girl named Victoria Richardson came to the police's attention. She had been in the parking lot on that tragic evening with her 18-year-old boyfriend and a couple of friends. They had been horseback riding in the park and returned to the parking lot after dark on February 22nd. According to Victoria, they were in their car, music blaring, preparing to leave when they heard unusual sounds. Initially, they mistook them for firecrackers or fireworks, paying little attention, but then realized they were gunshots. Victoria recalled seeing, just a minute and a half earlier, a man in a security guard's uniform walking towards a parked blue Ford Mustang nearby. After the strange sounds and the activation of a car alarm, the friends got out of their car and saw the Mustang, which had rolled backwards and stopped, no longer moving, who warned them of an armed person on the parking lot and advised caution. Hearing this, the group hurried back into their car and cautiously left the parking lot, trying not to draw attention. When asked to describe the guard they interacted with, Victoria mentioned he was a middle-aged, heavy-set African-American man. This description matched another employee who had worked in the parking lot the day before Raymond's shift. This second guard was immediately detained and questioned. He had a solid alibi, as he was at a family gathering at the time of the murder, confirmed by about 20 people. Therefore, despite inconsistencies in the witnesses' accounts, Jennings remained the sole suspect. Prolonged investigation and arrest. After 5 years, the investigation insisted that Raymond was the killer, partly because his knowledge and skills in forensics could convincingly deflect suspicion away from himself. However, evidence and witness testimonies didn't align coherently. The crime itself appeared irrational and odd, with no apparent motive for the suspect. Raymond had his own legally acquired pistol, which wasn't with him on the night of the murder. He presented this weapon to the police, and forensic analysis confirmed that the bullets weren't fired from it. Investigators speculated that he might have hidden unregistered firearms, but this theory was unsubstantiated. Meanwhile, the murdered girl's parents conducted their own investigation, hiring private detectives. Patricia and Michael felt the law enforcement was inadequately handling the case, or simply inactive. They actively engaged in interviews and TV appearances, sharing their story to pressure the authorities. They were convinced that Raymond was responsible for Michelle's death and should be punished. Although there were no strong reasons to detain him initially, Raymond went to Iraq for military service, where he stayed for almost 5 years. Upon returning to the United States, he was immediately arrested and jailed. Raymond consented to a polygraph test but failed, which worked against him. Unable to post the $1 million bail set, he had to remain in custody for about a year, while investigators and his defense prepared for trial. Trial and verdict. According to the prosecution, the security guard Raymond mistook Michelle in her revealing outfit for a sex worker and followed her to her car. After she rebuffed his advances, a scorned Raymond opened fire and then radioed his boss about the incident, stating he wouldn't approach the crime scene. The defense highlighted that the murder weapon was never found, either on the day or later. There were no DNA traces, fingerprints, or any signs of Raymond's presence at the crime scene. Interestingly, epithelial particles under the victim's nails did not match Raymond's DNA. Instead of probing whose DNA it was, the investigators convinced the court it was incidental contamination unrelated to the case. Raymond's personal belongings, car, locker, and home were thoroughly searched for the murder weapon, but a gunpowder residue test on his clothing was strangely not conducted at the time. Notably, Raymond resigned a few days after the incident due to threats from unknown individuals and returned his work uniform, which police received only a week later. It was claimed that he had thoroughly washed the uniform before returning it, thus erasing any gunpowder traces. However, traces of sweat and dust on the uniform indicated it hadn't been washed. Victoria Richardson, the aforementioned witness, testified in court, stating she saw a guard at the parking lot during the shooting. But she didn't specify who she saw, citing darkness and possible confusion. The prosecution seized upon her testimony as evidence of Raymond's guilt. The jury deliberated for a week, but couldn't reach a unanimous decision. As a result, a new trial was scheduled to give both sides time to prepare. In February 2009, 11 out of 12 jurors found Raymond guilty of murder. In December 2009, the Supreme Court convicted under aggravating circumstances, sentencing him to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 40 years. Raymond maintained his innocence, asserting in his final statement that he had no remorse since he didn't commit the crime. However, Michelle's parents and brother were convinced of his guilt and satisfied with the verdict. New trial and acquittal. Raymond Jennings spent nearly 11 years incarcerated, losing hope in justice as his appeals were repeatedly denied. However, in late 2015, renowned attorney Jeffrey Ehrlich and his son, Clinton, a law student at the time, took interest in his case. They revisited the case files and found numerous errors, inconsistencies, and blatant violations in the evidence and trial proceedings. The Ehrlichs believed Raymond was wrongfully convicted and set out to prove his innocence. They compiled all evidence and appealed to the department responsible for reviewing convictions. Specifically, they pointed out that Raymond's uniform showed no gunpowder residue or blood splatter, only sweat and dust, indicating it wasn't washed. Additionally, they noted that Raymond was unarmed and detectives failed to consider other individuals present at the park that evening. New reports suggested the murder was a spontaneous act, likely a botched robbery attempt. Victoria Richardson, the main witness, and her boyfriend, both with a criminal history, were serving time for armed robbery at the time of the final trial, but were never considered suspects. The mix of different cartridges fired from the same gun, unusual for someone with military training, hinted at a street gang style. Richardson and her boyfriend were part of such a gang, but since they weren't initially, many leads were irretrievably lost. Notably, the boyfriend wore an earring resembling the one found at the crime scene on the night of the murder. Despite failing to prove the criminal couple's involvement in the aspiring actress's murder, the Ehrlichs successfully established Jennings' innocence. Consequently, the former guard was factually acquitted, a significant distinction from legal or presumptive innocence. Sergeant Raymond Jennings was released from prison after nearly 11 years for a crime he didn't commit. The judge noted that jurors weren't informed about the presence of gang members at the crime scene that evening. In March 2017, Jennings received a $500,000 compensation for the wrongful conviction. A devout man, he later stated that God had heard his prayers and justice had prevailed. Only Michelle O'Keefe's parents remained deeply upset, believing the man they thought killed their daughter was wrongly freed. Having also lost their son in a car accident, the O'Keefes divorced, clinging to the belief that their daughter's supposed killer had been punished. Despite the case remaining unsolved, the likelihood of anyone being held accountable for Michelle's murder is now extremely low. Story 2. Ashes of the Condor. Quito, Ecuador, 2019. The sky above Quito was a dense, bruised gray, threatening rain but delivering nothing but a tension that hung over the city like a curse. In the maze of alleys below the El Panicillo Hill, where tourists rarely wandered and the streetlights were more ornamental than functional, a man named Claudio Morales pressed his back against a crumbling adobe wall, watching the world like a wolf disguised as a beggar. He wore a wool poncho and kept a limp in his left leg to complete the disguise, but beneath the folds of his shawl was a nickel-plated Tokarev pistol and a folded note that bore the name of the man he had flown across 3 borders to kill. Claudio, once a colonel in the Bolivian Air Force, now operated in the shadows of the disbanded and disillusioned, ex-soldiers, ghost agents, smugglers, and thieves, united by nothing but silence and survival. The man he was hunting, Vicente Rojos, had been one of the most elusive informants to ever cross the threshold of Interpol's South American database. He was rumored to be ex-intelligence from Chile, fluent in 6 languages, with scars along his back from a Peruvian black site. But now, according to Claudio's employer, an unnamed financier based out of Sao Paulo, Rojas had grown careless. He was living above a bar near La Mariscal under a false Colombian passport and had started to meet with men from the Mexican Sinaloa group, attempting to broker a deal involving high-altitude airdrops of synthetic opioids into the Peruvian Amazon. It was messy, too visible, and above all, unapproved by the invisible consortium that truly ran the drug routes from Caracas to Montevideo. For that breach, Rojas had to die. Claudio moved from shadow to shadow, one step at a time, careful not to attract the attention of the local patrols or the packs of desperate boys who roamed these districts at night looking for wallets or throats to slit. He carried nothing of value, except for the information in his head. The coordinates, the building layout, the faces of the men surrounding Rojas. Each detail was memorized with military precision. Every angle calculated with an assassin's cold intuition. The note in his pocket was a single sentence written in Portuguese. Make it look like vengeance. That was the rule. No clean kills. No silent entries. This had to seem personal, as if one of the countless ghosts Vicente Rojos had made over the years had finally caught up with him. The bar El Condor de Medianoche sat like a drunk memory between two shuttered bakeries. The exterior was painted with murals of Andean myths, gods with condor wings and serpent eyes, their feathers stained with red paint that looked too much like blood. Inside, the music was loud, the air thick with smoke and unwashed bodies, and the scent of stale aguardiente mixed with sweat and broken dreams. Claudio didn't enter through the front. He slipped into the alley behind, past the rusted trash bins and leaking gas canisters, until he found the iron fire door cracked open with a brick. A man was smoking beside it, distracted. Claudio didn't give him a chance to speak. The knife went in below the sternum and twisted once. The body slumped silently, bleeding into the shadows. He ascended the back stairs with the gait of a man not afraid to die, only afraid to fail. On the second floor was a long hallway lined with cracked doors and muted televisions playing Colombian telenovelas on low volume. Room 206. That's where Rojas was staying. According to Claudio's intel, he had a woman with him, an Ecuadorian journalist named Mirabel Ortega, who was either complicit or stupid, possibly both. Either way, she was expendable. As he reached the door, he didn't knock. He kicked. The door burst inward, striking the wall with a crash, and Claudio moved fast, 2 strides, then a pivot. Rojas was already reaching for a pistol on the nightstand, but Claudio was faster. The Tokarev barked twice, and the Chilean went down, shot through the chest and left arm. The woman screamed, frozen with fear, her hand halfway to her purse. Claudio glanced at her, then looked away. She wasn't the mission. Not yet. You were warned, Claudio said, stepping over Rojas's writhing body. But you couldn't help yourself. You thought you were the spider in the web. But you were just the fly. Rojas gurgled blood, tried to speak. Claudio leaned in, grabbed the dying man's hair, and whispered something only they could hear. Then he pulled back and fired once more, clean through the left eye. It was done. But that was when everything started to unravel. Outside, tires screeched. Lights flashed. Someone shouted in rapid Quechua. Claudio ducked behind the wall and peered through the broken blinds. A convoy, unmarked black trucks, not local police. Too well coordinated. He cursed. Someone had tipped them off. Maybe the girl. Maybe one of the men from the bar. Or maybe Rojas had known the hit was coming all along and triggered a dead man switch. Claudio didn't wait to find out. He exited through the hallway window, dropping 2 stories into a rain barrel, then sprinted barefoot down a side alley, shoes in one hand, pistol in the other. Alarms were already blaring. Radios crackled with chatter. He ducked into an abandoned market, kicked through a mesh gate, and made his way into the sewer tunnel beneath the main boulevard. The smell was hellish, but it gave him cover. He wouldn't stop until he crossed the Peruvian border. There were safe houses, old friends, people who still owed him favors. But in his gut, he knew this wasn't over. Rojas's death had stirred something older than debt. It had awakened interest. The kind that came from people who never spoke in public and never forgave breaches. He would need to disappear again. New face, new identity, new mission. South America, for all its open roads and remote valleys, was shrinking fast. And somewhere in the jungle, beyond the reach of satellites and soldiers, another man had just opened a package containing a photograph of Claudio Morales, taken only minutes ago, from a drone he hadn't seen. Beneath it, a note in Spanish. The condor has killed. Now the serpents begin to move. Claudio Morales had escaped worse: interrogation bunkers in Santa Cruz, a gunship downing over the Atacama, and once, a burning safe house in Medellin where he'd leapt from the second floor with a broken rib and a duffel full of cartel-bearer bonds. But the days that followed Rojas's death were unlike any hunt he'd experienced. He had entered the borderlands expecting dust and disinterest, a ghost among other ghosts, but instead found himself followed by a string of deaths that seemed choreographed to send him a message: "You are not invisible anymore." The first body was that of a Quechua smuggler who had agreed to ferry him across the Rio Napo by canoe. They had camped beneath a collapsed watchtower that night, wrapped in silence and starlight, when the shot came from the dark, a single round through the smuggler's neck. Claudio rolled, pistol in hand, but saw no muzzle flash, no footprints, no shadows. Just blood and river mud, and a sick feeling in his chest that this was not random. Someone had known exactly where he would be. By the time he reached the Peruvian jungle outpost of Pantoja, he had changed identities twice, burned his original travel documents, and buried his Tokarev beneath a termite mound. The village was the kind of place satellites missed. A strip of huts and tin-roofed buildings arranged along a dirt airstrip that hadn't seen a functioning plane in years. Locals recognized him as nothing more than another weather-beaten drifter. But paranoia does not require logic, and Claudio had enough enemies in too many countries to trust quiet places. He paid in gold teeth pulled from an old stash hidden inside the lining of his belt, bought silence from a barmaid named Layla who claimed to have once run messages for the Shining Path, and slept with his eyes open and a knife beneath his spine. 2 nights later, he received his second message. It arrived not by mail or word of mouth, but on the wind, figuratively and quite literally. The wind carried the scent of burning flesh. It carried screams. Claudio followed it, blade drawn, across the dirt road behind the cantina and found 3 bodies pinned to a ceiba tree, their stomachs slashed open, eyes gouged, tongues nailed to the bark. He knew 2 of them by face. One had been a contact from Lima, ex-Navy turned fixer. The other was a young runner who trafficked SIM cards across borders. Both were supposed to be off-grid. Both had made the mistake of contacting him 2 days before. And scrawled in charcoal beside the corpses were 3 letters in dripping black: OIL. Claudio's blood ran cold. He hadn't heard that acronym in 5 years. Operación Invisible de Lince, a black-budget intelligence cell that had once operated out of Buenos Aires and had since gone underground, reborn as a decentralized enforcement arm for some of the continent's wealthiest power brokers. OIL didn't arrest. They didn't warn. They erased, efficiently and with theatrical brutality. The fact that they were after him now meant one of 2 things. Either Vicente Rojos had been more important than Claudio had known, or Rojos had not been the target at all. The theory twisted in Claudio's mind like smoke. He hadn't questioned the contract. Rojos was guilty of enough sins to fill 10 dossiers, but now he began to see holes in the narrative. The girl in the room, Mirabel Ortega, had disappeared after the hit. Witnesses reported her boarding a private helicopter 3 hours after the incident. No hospital entries, no interviews. Her name had vanished from immigration records. And then there was the drone, the one that had snapped his image mid-escape, delivering it to some unseen handler. Rojos had never dealt in that level of surveillance. But someone had. The trap wasn't the kill, it was the cleanup. And Claudio had walked right into it. On the 4th night in the jungle, he received the 3rd message. A radio transmission, intercepted on a civilian wave, though the signal was strong and oddly crisp. A woman's voice, familiar and calm, spoke in perfect Spanish. "We thank you for the execution of Mr. Rojos. Your debt to the organization is cleared. However, your presence is now a liability. You are advised to disappear permanently. If we find your scent in any city from Caracas to Ushuaia, we will send the jackals." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Claudio turned off the radio and stared into the fire for a long time, the flames crackling like bones beneath pressure. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or enraged. He had served his purpose, but like every tool that had outlived its usefulness, he was now to be discarded or hunted. They hadn't even granted him the dignity of a final mission. Just a whisper of death and the promise of silence. But Claudio Morales was not a man easily erased. The next morning he left Pantoja and began the long trek toward the Pacific, moving along rivers and back channels known only to narcos and snake oil prophets. He traveled light, carrying only a machete, a flask of kerosene, and a map burned at the edges that he'd recovered from Rojos's motel room. The one detail that hadn't made sense. It wasn't a map of South America. It was a partial chart of West Africa, with a red circle drawn over Abidjan, Ivory Coast. Why would a Chilean agent planning a synthetic drop over the Andes have a map of Africa in his private documents? That was the question that kept Claudio awake as he crossed ravines and bribed smugglers with ounces of morphine. The deeper he dug, the more the shape of the conspiracy began to emerge. Not a triangle but a web, stretching from the coca fields of Bolivia to the ports of Dakar, where chemical precursors flowed from Chinese containers like poisoned veins. Rojas had not been a rebel. He had been a broker, trying to set up a new corridor, a rogue artery in a global circulatory system built on addiction and compliance. And someone had used Claudio to sever that artery before it could be traced to its beating heart. By the time Claudio reached the outskirts of Guayaquil, he had made his decision. He would not run. He would not vanish into some Peruvian cloud forest or adopt a false life as a carpenter in Montevideo. If they wanted him erased, then he would draw their attention. He would climb back into the nightmare from which he had once escaped and claw at the mask hiding the architects behind OIL. And when the jackals came, he would greet them not with fear, but with fire. Because the condor did not fly to survive. It soared to strike. Let's jump to next story. Story 3. The Crimson Summit. Colombia-Brazil borderlands, 2018. The jungle breathed in hushed tones as dusk descended over the tri-border region between Colombia, Brazil, and Peru, where the laws of man dissolved into mist and vines, and the trees bore silent witness to trades of blood, drugs, and whispered secrets. At the heart of this rotting Eden stood the town of Tabatinga, a humid sprawl of tin roofs and narrow alleys soaked in diesel and desperation. To the outsider, it was little more than a chaotic river port. To those who dealt in darker currencies, it was the spine of an invisible empire, a place where every crate, every whisper, every glint of foreign currency flowed upward toward a single name, Marcos Iberpura, the so-called Crimson Baron of the Upper Amazon. No one ever saw Marcos in person. His legend moved in the mouths of mercenaries and mules, in the nods of corrupt customs officers who turned their backs at the flash of a coded tattoo. He didn't command armies so much as he influenced ecosystems. Men like him didn't need to enforce loyalty. They let the jungle do it. An enemy who went missing in the forest stayed missing. Sometimes bones surfaced months later, picked clean, nestled in vines like offerings to ancient gods. Other times, nothing returned but the scent of iron on the breeze. But Marcos's web had started to tear. Quietly at first, then with increasing violence. A smuggler's body turned up with his tongue nailed to his palm in Leticia, eyes wide in a rictus of agony. A shipment of processed coca vanished en route to Manaus, its escort team slaughtered, throats slit with surgical precision. And someone Marcos had never seen, was sending him postcards. Not digital traces, not intercepted signals. Actual paper postcards, mailed to decoy addresses he thought no one knew existed. The first showed an empty cathedral in Bogota. The second, a submerged alley in Rio after a storm. Both marked in red ink with the same phrase, "Your sins return by water." The man Marcos sent to investigate these anomalies was not a friend, but a liability he could afford to lose. Eduardo Salazar, former intelligence operative for a dissolved Colombian shadow agency, now eking out a living coordinating clandestine shipments and laundering profits through shell construction companies in Medellin. Eduardo was brilliant, cold, and utterly without allegiance to anyone but himself. The perfect hound for a mission too dangerous to assign to loyal men. Eduardo had no illusions about Marcos's intentions. The Crimson Baron believed in utility, not loyalty. He had asked Eduardo to trace the source of the threats not because he trusted him, but because he suspected that Eduardo might already be involved. And Eduardo, knowing this, accepted the task for the same reason a man might lean into a punch to find out who throws it. Because he was tired of running from shadows. Because for once, he wanted to confront the architect behind the rot, even if it meant dying in the confrontation. His investigation began in Leticia, where the smuggler's body had been found. The scene had been scrubbed, no prints, no bullet casings, only a carved spiral in the wall above the corpse, as though left there by some pagan cult. The local police shrugged, chalking it up to narco-violence. Eduardo wasn't satisfied. He spoke to street kids, bribed a retired medic, and paid an old woman who lived by the docks to show him a cell phone video she'd deleted, but not yet overwritten. The shaky clip showed the smuggler alive, hands bound, being dragged by two masked men wearing white shirts with hand-painted red waves across the chest. Not a cartel mark, Not a gang sign. Something older. More intentional. Eduardo began to follow the pattern of the waves. They led him across the river, into the Brazilian interior, where he encountered whispers of a splinter group once tied to the Movimento dos Sem Terra. Radicals who had broken off, fusing revolutionary ideology with shamanistic ritual and a strict code of retribution. They called themselves a Irmandade de Mare Vermelha, the Brotherhood of the Crimson Tide. Supposedly eradicated in the early 2000s after a failed siege on a corporate-owned dam site, they had vanished from the headlines, presumed extinct. But Eduardo saw the signs: ciphers in graffiti, chants in backwater churches, coordinates embedded in the rhythms of local folklore. This was not just revenge. It was resurrection. And the target was not just Marcos. It was the entire edifice of transnational corruption that sustained the narco-extractive machine, stretching from Sao Paulo to Bogota. The postcards were warnings, yes, but also invitations. Eduardo wasn't being hunted. He was being recruited, or tested. The real question wasn't whether he would uncover the Brotherhood. It was whether he would join them. But Eduardo had always stood apart. Too compromised to be a martyr. Too ethical, in some buried way, to be a kingpin. He walked the knife's edge because he feared what lived on either side. And now the knife was tilting. In a jungle clearing near São Gabriel de Cachoeira, he finally encountered one of them. Not a killer, not a priest, but a boy no older than 16, dressed in river-soaked rags, skin covered in ritual ink and freshwater scars. The boy handed him another postcard, this one blank on one side, and on the other simply written: "The tide rises in Parentins. You have 1 week. Decide who you are." Then the boy ran, disappearing into the brush before Eduardo could ask another question. He stood there sweating, exhausted, furious, and more alive than he'd felt in years. Because now he understood. The Brotherhood didn't want Marcos dead. They wanted his throne emptied. They wanted someone to inherit the system and tear it down from within. Someone who already knew the codes, the players, the streets. Someone like Eduardo. And that was the real game Marcos had never seen. The real story buried under rivers and blood. Because sometimes to end the corruption, you had to sit at its summit and set it on fire. Parentins was draped in the echo of drums and red silk by the time Eduardo Salazar arrived, the air swollen with humidity and something heavier, anticipation. The annual Boy Bumba festival had just ended, leaving behind only confetti-drowned gutters, shattered plastic chairs, and the lingering scent of sweat, perfume, and spilled beer. But beneath that carnival haze, something else pulsed, an undercurrent of ritual not performed for tourists or tradition, but for retribution. Eduardo had not come for folklore. He had come to answer the Brotherhood's invitation. And he came armed, not with guns, but with knowledge. Names, routes, transaction nodes, and proof of betrayal. The postcard had not been a bluff. As the boat eased toward the pier, he saw them waiting. 2 men dressed not in crimson robes or jungle rags, but crisp civilian clothing, their stance military, their eyes unreadable. No weapons in sight, which made them even more dangerous. Eduardo disembarked slowly, his duffel bag slung loosely across his shoulder, heavy with encrypted drives and forged manifests. He gave no resistance as they flanked him wordlessly and led him through a back alley, down a flight of rotting stairs, into a cellar that smelled of damp stone and pepper oil. There, amid flickering fluorescent bulbs, stood a woman. She was older than Eduardo by 10 years, maybe 15, with the calm presence of someone who had watched death pass often enough to stop flinching. Her name, he learned, was Ira Gomez, and once long ago, she had trained in insurgent warfare in the highlands of Bolivia. She was the last surviving architect of the Crimson Tide, a woman who had once been buried alive in a state-run prison camp for 13 days and emerged with a scream that shattered her interrogator's mind. Marcos Iberpura had believed her dead. Many had, but some ideas do not die, they just change form. Eduardo placed the duffel on the table. "I didn't come to join you," he said. "I know," Ira replied, unzipping the bag. She sorted through the files like a priest handling relics. "You came to see if I'm real. If this isn't some jungle ghost story. You came to see if you could outmaneuver Marcos." "I came because your men are killing people I trained," Eduardo said. "Because the system is crumbling, and when it falls, it won't choose who it lands on." Ira smiled without warmth. "We don't kill for vengeance. We kill to clear the soil." Marcos turned the river into a vein of poison. He cuts deals with foreign extractors who drain our land, pay off our courts, and erase entire villages under the banner of development. He is not the disease. He is the parasite thriving on it. And you think I'll help you cure it? I think you're already here. That's enough. For hours they spoke. Eduardo learned that the Brotherhood was no longer a scattered fringe, but a quiet insurgency embedded across 4 nations, using abandoned missionary routes, decommissioned drug airstrips, and the shell corporations Marcos himself had built to hide their rebirth. They didn't seek power, only removal. A purge of those who had turned the Amazon into a marketplace of pain. Marcos was the key, not because he was the worst, but because he was the linchpin. Remove him with precision, and the web collapses inward. But Eduardo wasn't a martyr. He had no illusions of legacy. He wanted leverage and survival, and something resembling truth. So he offered Ayera something else, an inside betrayal. Over the last year, Eduardo had been tasked by Marcos to set up a new route for synthetic drug distribution into North America, using luxury fishing boats and false tourism shells along the Pacific coast. But what Marcos didn't know was that Eduardo had built-in back doors, routing codes and shipment manifests tied not to narco buyers, but to independent watchdog groups in Canada and Argentina. He could burn the entire operation in 3 keystrokes. Ayera listened, considered, and then made a counteroffer. You burn it publicly, she said. During a shipment drop, force Marcos to show his face, or at least one of his inner circle. In the chaos, we strike. It was suicidal, but it was also beautiful. 1 week later, on a clouded morning in the Bay of Guayaquil, Eduardo stood aboard a 40-foot luxury fishing vessel that carried no fish, only carefully packed canisters of synthetic fentanyl, each labeled as marine refrigeration units. The drop was scheduled for 9 a.m., when the Coast Guard's patrol cycle would be shifting. He had sent the tip hours earlier to a Canadian narcotics task force embedded with Ecuadorian law enforcement. They wouldn't catch Marcos, but they would draw out his handler. When the explosion came, it wasn't from the Coast Guard. It came from under the dock, a remote charge that ripped the pier in half and sent Eduardo flying into the water. He surfaced coughing, blood in his ears, just in time to see the body of Joaquin Navarro, Marcos's chief distributor, float face down amid shards of burning wood. The Brotherhood had acted. Precisely. Lethally. And Eduardo, he vanished. He took nothing. Not his forged IDs, not his accounts, not his name. For the next 2 months, rumors of his presence surfaced in the most unlikely places. A med clinic in Paramaribo, a smuggler's grave in Kian, a freighter docked off the coast of Recife. Each rumor contradicted the last. Some said he'd joined Ayera's war council. Others believed he'd turned himself into Interpol under a new identity. But one thing was certain, Marcos Iberpura never re-emerged. His empire fractured. His lieutenants vanished or defected. And where his name had once summoned silence, now it was spoken with pity. As for the Brotherhood of the Crimson Tide, they did not claim victory. They did not appear on broadcasts or graffiti walls. But they expanded, quietly, ruthlessly, systematically. And in a riverside village no satellite had ever mapped, a woman stirred a clay pot of soup, glanced toward the trees, and nodded at the man sharpening a machete outside. A man who once called himself Eduardo Salazar. Let's jump to next story. Story 4. The Dust Between Borders. Borderlands of Bolivia and Paraguay, South America. In the far reaches of the Gran Chaco, where the sun burns low like a molten coin, and the air tastes of scorched salt and diesel, the land forgets which country it belongs to. Bolivia or Paraguay, it didn't matter out here. The law didn't live in these borderlands. It fled them. Trucks moved through the dry arteries of the Chaco like ghosts, carrying soybeans one way, rifles and oxycodone the other. There were no signs, no checkpoints, only the hush of tall yellow grass, the occasional burst of cicada song, and the intermittent stench of rot whenever someone crossed the wrong path. This was where Vicente Ortega chose to disappear. A man no longer wanted for what he had done, but for what he might yet reveal. Before 2016, Vicente had been a customs liaison in Asunción, another forgettable middleman whose job was to stamp paperwork he knew was fake and smile through the greasy bribes handed to him by men with sharper suits and duller eyes. His job had been simple. Don't look too closely, don't ask why shipments moved at midnight, and never, ever write anything down. But Vicente had broken the unspoken rule. He'd written. Not for the police, not for justice, but for leverage. Names, dates, locations, shipments. He kept it all in a blue-covered notebook, hidden behind a fake wall in his cheap apartment. Each page a thread that could unravel a multi-million-dollar trafficking network that spanned 3 borders and half a dozen ministries. When the wrong people learned he had it, Vicente vanished. But vanishing in South America is like hiding in a river filled with piranhas. You'll be invisible for a while, but the blood always finds its way to the surface. By mid-2016, the cartel he once worked under, Los Jinetes del Monte, had already put a bounty on his head. 2 men had already died looking for him, and a third, a Bolivian informant named Damian Quevedo, had his tongue nailed to a fence post outside Philadelphia with a note that read, "Books are for reading, not confessing." Vicente, meanwhile, moved eastward like a fever dream, slipping between border posts, sleeping in truck cabs and chicken coops, shaving his head, growing it back, faking a limp, then faking a limp on the other leg to confuse anyone watching. He no longer trusted his reflection, let alone the people who offered him refuge. He knew he didn't have long. That's when he made contact with someone more dangerous than the men chasing him. A woman named Tania Corrales, an ex-military intelligence officer turned ghost broker. She helped people vanish for a price. Tania had built her own legend. Rumors claimed she had once blackmailed an entire provincial governor's cabinet into silence using a flash drive and a hotel surveillance tape. Others said she poisoned her former CO with powdered scopolamine. Vicente didn't care which story was true. All he knew was that she had access to safe houses, satellite comms, and identities clean enough to fool even the most aggressive customs AI. But her price wasn't cash. It was content. She wanted the notebook. She didn't want it for justice either. Tania didn't believe in justice. She believed in chessboards, and the notebook was a queen piece no one else had touched. If she had it, she could control the entire game. Vicente hesitated, even considered destroying it instead, burning every page, reducing every name and date and location to ash, leaving nothing behind. But then he remembered his sister in La Paz, who had vanished after calling him in tears about a man who came to her pharmacy asking questions about his habits. He remembered his former partner, Joaquin, found in the trunk of a firebombed car. And he remembered that some information, once acquired, could never truly be silenced. He made a deal. The exchange was to happen on a dead stretch of land 30 kilometers from Mariscal Estigarribia, where rusted oil drums formed a makeshift perimeter around a defunct cattle station. The plan was simple. Vicente would come with the original notebook, unscanned, unphotographed. Tania would bring him a set of forged Bolivian national IDs, passage to a smuggler's airfield near Villamants, and an exit flight that would take him to Suriname under the alias Carlos Diaz. They would both leave with what they needed. Of course, nothing went to plan. Tania showed up, but so did a third party, a man named Renato Silva, a former paramilitary contractor turned freelance enforcer for Los Jinetes. He'd been following Tania's electronic trail for weeks, tracing her comms, bribing her black market courier in San Pedro. When he appeared, it was not with a warning, but with a belt-fed machine pistol and a calm that chilled the skin. Vicente ran before the second body dropped. Tania's men returned fire, and for a few moments, the silence of the Chaco was obliterated by gunfire, shattered glass, and the acrid scent of melting metal. Vicente didn't look back. He knew if the notebook survived the flames, it wouldn't matter who held it. Someone was going to die for every line it contained. By nightfall, the only evidence of the meeting was a blood-stained bandana, an overturned truck, and a black leather satchel half buried in the dust. Inside, 64 handwritten pages. The satchel disappeared that night, swept away by a trembling hand belonging to a local scavenger named Eloy Vargas, a man whose loyalty was not to politics, cartels, or any flag, but to survival. He had seen the smoke from kilometers away, and followed it like a moth circling a dying flame. Eloy had learned long ago that in the aftermath of violence, wealth often lay abandoned in plain sight. He didn't know who the dead were, nor did he care, only that one had been wearing Italian boots, and another had dropped a sat phone still blinking with coordinates. But it was the satchel that caught his eye, half buried beneath the skeletal remains of what once might have been a diplomatic SUV. Eloy opened it with shaking fingers, expecting cash or cocaine. What he found instead were neat blue-lined pages filled with names, numbers, crude maps, and phrases that meant nothing to him, until he read the words Sinad Chief Asuncion, next to a string of payment dates. Even a man like Eloy, who had never finished primary school and survived off scavenged wires and petrol siphoning, understood what kind of fire he had just picked up. This wasn't money, it was leverage, the kind of thing people killed for. And he had it. By morning, Vicente Ortega was halfway to Santa Cruz, traveling under the name Marco Rivas, with a falsified transit visa stitched into his backpack and a stitched-up gunshot graze across his right thigh. Tanya Corrales was missing. No confirmed body, no trace, only a smoldering patch of red clay where her signal last pinged. Renato Silva's death was confirmed later that week by a grim-faced contact in Sucre, who emailed a single photograph of his burned-out skull with a handwritten message in Portuguese. Too late. But Vicente had bigger problems than counting ghosts. The notebook was gone. Whatever chance he had at bargaining for safe passage vanished with that satchel. He had traded the only currency that mattered for a future that no longer existed. And in a twist both bitter and fitting, he now became one more man running from a truth he had created. Eloy, meanwhile, became aware, dangerously aware, of the notebook's value within 24 hours. He tried selling it first to a military captain in Villamontes, a former client of his brother's contraband route. The man took one look and ordered Eloy to leave his office at gunpoint. "This is not paper," he had growled. "This is a coffin." Next, Eloy tried his luck with a journalist, a wiry Paraguayan woman who worked freelance for an international watchdog group. She listened intently, asked too many questions, and vanished the next morning. Her hotel room was empty save for a shattered phone and a bullet buried in the drywall. Eloy finally understood. This wasn't something you sold. It was something you survived. And to survive, he had to disappear just like the man who had written it. The problem was the notebook had a pulse. Every name in it was still breathing. Every transaction still echoing through bank servers in Panama. Every shipment still crawling down rivers in black-painted hulls. Whoever held the book held the blueprint of a continent's corruption. But Eloy wasn't a player. He wasn't Vicente. He had no plan, no contacts, no Tanya to call. He was just a desperate man with a bomb in his hands and nowhere to bury it. 3 weeks later, in a smoky cantina outside of Tarija, Eloy's luck ran out. A man with a silver tooth and a military haircut sat beside him at the bar and ordered 2 beers. He never gave his name, but he knew Eloy's. Knew where he had grown up, the prison his father had died in, the name of the woman who once sold him antibiotics during a dengue outbreak. The man never threatened him directly. He didn't have to. Instead, he slid over a folded piece of paper with a time, a place, and a price. "If you're smart," he whispered, "you'll bring it. If you're stupid, you'll die without ever spending a peso of what it could have earned you." Then he left, and Eloy sat staring at the paper until his beer went warm. The meeting point was a canyon road outside Yaquiba, where the jungle turned to rock and echoes carried for miles. Eloy arrived early, the notebook wrapped in layers of duct tape and sealed in a plastic lining inside his satchel. He brought no weapon, just sweat, fear, and a prayer to saints he hadn't spoken to since he was 9. The man with the silver tooth showed up late, flanked by 2 others with rifles and dead eyes. The transaction was brief. A duffel bag full of crisp American bills changed hands. Eloy counted none of it. He just took the money and walked away, knees weak, lungs shaking, eyes wet with the knowledge that somehow, against all odds, he had lived. But the story didn't end there. The notebook didn't disappear. It resurfaced in fragments, leaked to certain journalists in Lima, whispered through anonymous blog posts, used as leverage by unknown politicians during a scandal that shook the Bolivian National Congress later that year. People fell. One senator was found drowned in his own swimming pool. A customs warehouse in Santa Cruz mysteriously burned down. A child trafficking ring linked to a church-run orphanage was exposed. But most of the names in the book, those with power, money, or military titles, escaped untouched. They always did. And Vicente Ortega? He made it as far as Suriname. Bought a boat. Grew a beard. Changed names again. But he never stopped looking over his shoulder. Never stopped waiting for the sound of a helicopter, a footstep too heavy on gravel, or a knock that came too late at night. Because the truth was simple. He had let something out into the world. And once truth escapes, it never stops hunting the people who set it free. Let's jump to next story. Story 5. Shadows of the Plateau. Peru-Bolivia border, 2015. The highlands of Puno held their secrets well beneath blankets of fog and coca fields masked as potato farms, where the chill of morning was sliced not by sunlight, but by the sound of propellers and the whispers of betrayal. In the village of Capachica, where stray dogs roamed with rib cages like folded umbrellas and children played with slings instead of smartphones, a man named Baltazar Reynoso returned after years of vanishing. He was not remembered with fondness, but with cautious nods. He had once been a police inspector in Arequipa, until a raid gone wrong exposed his hand in the disappearance of seized evidence, namely 3 kilos of uncut Bolivian crystal meth that was never logged into the station registry. He fled not for fear of jail, but because he knew too much about the men who had allowed him to escape. When he came back, it wasn't under the Reynoso name. Now he was Don Balthazar, a middle-aged land trader with vague scars, an outdated revolver beneath his leather belt, and a leather-bound notebook filled with coordinates, names, and times of day scribbled in Quechua. The villagers, some of whom remembered his father, a bootlegger who had once burned alive in a smuggler's van, said nothing. This was the Altiplano, and silence here was currency. What brought Balthazar back wasn't nostalgia, and it sure as hell wasn't redemption. It was a deal. A shipment of high-grade Peruvian pink cocaine, processed in the hidden labs of Apurimac, was scheduled to cross Lake Titicaca in fishing vessels rigged with false hulls. The drugs were bound for La Paz, then overland to Sao Paulo, where a local gang named Os Mandibulas had offered triple rate for product untied to Colombian supply lines. The route had been tested with empty crates, and bribes had been paid to lake patrols, customs clerks, and even a Catholic deacon who was to bless the boats before their departure. But now something had gone wrong. 2 of the boats were missing. One captain was dead, strangled with the rope from his own anchor chain, left in an alley outside of Juliaca with a condom full of powdered detergent stuffed in his mouth. A message, or worse, a warning. The cartel in Sao Paulo was furious, threatening to switch suppliers and leak the route to rival factions. Balthazar had been called in not to supervise, but to investigate, and if necessary, eliminate. He rented a room above a butcher's shop run by a woman who didn't ask questions, but had a son who did. The boy, maybe 12 or 13, lingered in the mornings to ask about the scars on Balthazar's hand or the strange devices he carried, one of which was a Russian field radio wrapped in plastic sheeting. Balthazar told him the scars came from wrestling jaguars and that the radio was a toy. The boy laughed and called him Tio de las Mentiras. That was the closest thing to warmth Balthazar would experience in those months. His first visit was to the harbor at Chiquito, where the cartel had last had radio contact with the missing vessels. He found signs of a struggle on the dock, scratches on the wooden pilings, traces of blood on a mooring cleat, and a bullet lodged in the concrete wall behind the customs shack. He questioned the night guard, an old man with cataracts who claimed he'd heard only seagulls. Balthazar knew better. He paid the man 200 sols and returned that night, waiting in the shadow of a warehouse with a view of the water. Around 3:14 a.m., a skiff approached. No lights, just the soft creak of wood and the purr of a tiny outboard. Inside were 2 figures. One dumped something into the water. The other took photographs. Balthazar didn't move. He watched. He memorized faces. One of them was a name he'd seen in that leather notebook, Alonso Guerra, a former Navy cadet turned freelance transporter, known for his steady hand and icy nerves. Guerra was supposed to be on Balthazar's payroll. Yet here he was, under moonlight, dumping evidence or bodies into the lake. The next morning, Balthazar crossed into Bolivia by land, using a false passport issued by a Lima contact. In Copacabana, he met a fixer named Raquel Menezes, an ex-journalist who now traded information like others traded grain. Raquel confirmed that Os Mandibulas had sent a scout, a tattooed enforcer known only as Grifo, to audit the operation. Grifo was known in Brazilian favelas as the man who poured gasoline first and asked questions never. Rumor had it he had already arrived in La Paz, buying guns and asking about Reynoso by his old name. Balthazar knew what that meant. He had 5, maybe 6 days before Grifo found him. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he wrote letters, coded ones, in case he died. One to an old lieutenant who owed him a favor, one to a bank in Quito that held the last of his offshore money, and one to someone he hadn't seen in decades. His daughter, Lucia, now living in Chile under a new name, unaware of the rot in her bloodline. He wrote not to confess, but to warn. If anyone comes asking about me, deny it. If they mention the lake, hang up the phone. Don't look at the news. Don't come to my funeral. But he wasn't done yet. Balthazar returned to Chiquito with a borrowed drone and scanned the coastlines. In a cove masked by reeds and fallen trees, he found the missing boats. Both. No longer floating. They had been dragged ashore, stripped and burned. Bullet holes riddled the hulls. That was when he knew it wasn't just theft or sabotage. It was a coup. Someone inside the cartel had tried to reroute the shipment, cut out the Peruvian end, and take the full Sao Paulo payout. And the only man with the maps, the contacts, and the recklessness to do that was Guerra. But Guerra wouldn't work alone. He'd need a buyer, a briber, and someone on the inside to clean up his trail. Baltazar now had names. Now he needed proof. And proof, in this game, usually came with a price measured in bodies. Baltazar didn't believe in redemption, but he believed in revenge, specifically the quiet, efficient kind that left behind no noise but the creak of footsteps over old blood. By the time the sun rose over the lake the next day, he had already bribed a fisherman to retrieve a waterproof bag he had stashed near the Uros Islands years ago, back when he still thought retirement meant peace. Inside were two things: a Tokarev pistol with the serial number filed off, and a worn cassette tape marked Gallo 42. The tape didn't play music. It was a recording from a wire he'd planted on an Arequipa commander in 2009. Something about routes, a betrayal, and Guerra's name mentioned too many times to ignore. It wasn't enough for the law, but it would be enough for leverage. That afternoon, he went to find Raquel Menezes again, this time not for information, but for introduction. She led him to a nondescript cafe in El Alto, where high altitude and low trust kept tongues quiet and espresso thick enough to hide the taste of arsenic. There, they met a contact, an underling from the Brazilian gang, a man in a leather jacket with eyes like cracked glass and a surgical scar running along his scalp. His name was Taquinho, and he listened while Baltazar laid out his case, piece by piece. The double cross, the bodies, the boats, and most importantly, the fact that Guerra had gone rogue and was planning a side deal with rival suppliers from northern Paraguay. The tape, played on an old Walkman, gave the conversation the weight it needed. Taquinho nodded, said nothing, and left. That was how the Brazilians answered. With silence first, then violence. Baltazar knew he'd just pulled the pin from a grenade. All he had to do now was throw it in the right direction. But before he could, Raquel warned him. Griffo had arrived in Puno. He was asking for addresses, offering money, and according to her sources, already had pictures of Baltazar leaving the customs shack by the lake. He wasn't going to wait for explanations. He was there to kill. That night, Baltazar boarded a night bus back to the Peruvian side. He wore a beard glued on with tree sap and charcoal, and pretended to be a shepherd from Tacna. At one checkpoint, the guards joked about smuggling wool. No one recognized him, yet, but the noose was tightening. When he returned to the butcher's shop, the woman was gone. The son, too. In the place of his room, someone had left a bullet casing wrapped in a scrap of paper with a word written in Portuguese: traitor. Baltazar didn't panic. He vanished. He moved through caves, abandoned colonial mines, and coca trails known only to smugglers and snakes. By the time he surfaced again, 2 days had passed. In that time, 3 people were murdered in La Paz: a customs officer, a boat repairman, and a priest. All 3 had been paid by Baltazar's original crew. All 3 were found with plastic rosaries jammed into their throats, Griffo's signature. Baltazar realized then this wasn't just retaliation. It was a purge. Someone, maybe even the Brazilians, had decided to burn the entire operation, erase the trail, and restart the route with fresh blood. And he, the man with all the knowledge, the maps, the contacts, had suddenly become not just expendable, but dangerous. His only chance was to make himself useful again. So useful that killing him would be more expensive than protecting him. He reached out to Taquinho one last time. This time, he didn't offer evidence. He offered an entire shipment, 12 sealed drums of synthetic cocaine paste, hidden in an abandoned textile mill on the outskirts of Moquegua, left untouched since the civil unrest of 2001. The product was still good. He had the keys, the location, and the old access codes. All he wanted was protection, a seat at the table, and the head of Alonso Guerra. Taquinho didn't answer. But someone did. At 3 a.m., 2 trucks arrived. Men got out. Not Taquinho. Not Brazilians. But Quechua mercenaries, the kind Baltazar knew from his time in Apurimac, men who didn't speak unless paid to. They handed him a new passport, a plane ticket to Paraguay, and a duffel bag containing $20,000 and a photograph. Guerra, taken from above. Dead. Shot in the chest. A message scrawled in red marker. Now you owe us. Baltazar didn't celebrate. He stared at the photograph for a long time. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like the door to a deeper cage. He had orchestrated a death and inherited the debt. Now the Brazilians wouldn't just tolerate him. They owned him. Every map he drew, every name he whispered would now serve them. The silence of the lake had become his contract. Before he left Peru, he did one last thing. He returned to the harbor at Chiquito in the early morning fog and buried the notebook beneath a stone slab marked with no name. He didn't burn it. He didn't keep it. He simply let it go. Maybe some boy would find it, years later, and try to understand the ghosts of a trade he should never enter. Maybe no one would. Maybe it was better that way. On the flight to Asunción, Baltazar sat by the window, drank a small bottle of rum, and stared out at the endless green. He thought about Lucia, about her last birthday, about her mother, about the photo he still kept in his boot. He would never see her again. That was the cost of what he had become. Not the blood on his hands, but the fingerprints he could never leave behind. In South America, the land remembers. The rivers whisper. And even in the high silence of the Andes, a name like Baltazar Reynoso still echoes in the mouths of those too afraid to speak it aloud. Let's jump to next story. Story 6. Echoes in the Dust. South America, 2014. In the parched basin between the Colombian Sierra Nevada foothills and the lawless frontier of Venezuela, the town of San Rafael baked beneath a sun so ruthless it peeled paint from cinderblock walls and shriveled fruit before it could ripen. To the outsider, the town seemed barely alive, roosters fighting in alleyways, tin roofs shimmering under the heat, and the skeletal remains of once thriving sugar plantations tangled in vines and rust. But San Rafael had a pulse, one that beat to the rhythm of trucks rumbling through at night with their headlights off and their cargo sealed in silence. And on one such evening in the late summer of 2014, the pulse skipped violently when a man named Horacio Mendez returned after nearly a decade of absence, wearing a linen suit that smelled of diesel and salt, and carrying nothing but a briefcase wrapped in duct tape and a story too dark to be told all at once. He arrived without warning and walked straight to the cantina at the edge of the market square, where the air was thick with sweat, rum, and the sour breath of men who'd lost count of the years since their last paycheck. No one greeted him. No one dared. Not because they didn't know him, but because they did. Horacio Mendez had once been a name whispered between teeth during funeral processions and shouted from rooftops when shipments arrived ahead of schedule. In the early 2000s, before the Federals started cracking skulls in Cucuta and the Cartel del Norte fractured under its own greed, Horacio was the man who controlled the riverways that fed cocaine down into Brazil, heroin into Panama, and weapons into the hands of any militia willing to keep the routes flowing. He didn't kill people, he bought them. And when money didn't work, he erased them with a quiet efficiency that made legends out of rumors. But then came the raid, the betrayal, the fire, the night when 3 boats exploded on the Magdalena River and Horacio's brother was dragged into the jungle by masked gunmen and never seen again. Horacio disappeared after that. Some said he'd died in Angola, laundering money through offshore diamond mines. Others swore they'd seen him in Paraguay, drinking alone, eyes empty, waiting to be arrested or killed. No one imagined he would return to San Rafael. Yet here he was, ordering coffee like a regular, ignoring the loaded glances from men who owed him debts too old to pay and scars too fresh to forget. He waited at that table for hours until a boy, barefoot, thin, his cheeks hollowed by hunger, approached and handed him a note folded 6 times. Horacio opened it slowly. Inside, written in blood-red ink, was a name, Candela. His jaw tightened. Candela had once been a code word between brothers, used for shipments that needed discretion, and for people whose deaths couldn't be traced. But here, in this moment, it meant something else. Candela was alive, and Candela had called him back. 2 hours later, he walked down to the slaughterhouse on the outskirts of town, where pigs screamed through rusted gates and blood ran into the earth like wine. It was there he found her, not Candela herself, but the girl who had taken her name, Vicente Ortega, daughter of an informant executed in front of a judge in Bogotá and raised among the knives and sawdust of the black market. She was young, no more than 25, with hard eyes and a voice that flicked like a switchblade. She told Horacio everything in a tone devoid of apology, that the Cartel del Norte had restructured, that the bosses were no longer men but committees of shareholders, and that San Rafael was the key to a new corridor stretching into Venezuela, where corrupt colonels were trading diesel, sugar, and refugees for high-grade fentanyl bound for Europe. Horacio didn't speak, only listened as she explained how she'd rebuilt part of his old network, one favor at a time, and how Candela, the woman he once loved, the assassin who saved him from a bullet in 2006, had survived the fire and was now being held in the Guarico province by mercenaries who called themselves La Sangre Nueva. The moment she said that name, Horacio stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply nodded and walked out, as if he already knew what needed to be done. That night, he opened the duct-taped briefcase beneath the flickering light of a rented room above the bakery. Inside were three things: a suppressed Russian Makarov pistol, a folder full of smuggled Venezuelan military intelligence, and a photograph taken from a rooftop. A blurry image of Candela, hair cut short, sitting between two heavily armed men, her hands tied behind her back. The folder detailed an upcoming transfer. Candela was to be handed over to government forces in 2 days as a gesture of goodwill between traffickers and military defectors. Horacio knew this game. It wasn't goodwill. It was leverage. Someone had told them he was coming, and now they were using her as bait. But they underestimated the man they had summoned. The following morning, Horacio paid a coyote to guide him through the dry border paths, where cacti grew from old landmines and the bones of dead mules were picked clean by hawks. He traveled in silence, his linen suit stained with dust and the sweat of vengeance. By the time they reached the first Venezuelan checkpoint, he had already bribed 2 guards and slit the throat of a third who recognized him too quickly. War, Horacio had once said, is just business with fewer contracts and more burial. And this was war. Not just for Candela, not just for the past, but for the future of a network that could either become his redemption or his grave. By sundown, he was camped a kilometer from the compound where Candela was being held. He watched through a stolen pair of binoculars as soldiers paced between watchtowers, and trucks came and went under cover of twilight. He didn't see her, but he felt her presence, like a whisper in the wind, like a name you couldn't forget even after burying it with your own hands. He didn't sleep that night. He cleaned his pistol, counted his bullets, and waited for the darkness to fall thick enough to become his ally again. By dawn, the world was a muted canvas of orange and gray, with the air thick with the humidity of the approaching storm. Horacio's fingers tightened around the Makarov as he crouched low behind a bush, scanning the compound once more. The guards were fewer now, less vigilant, distracted by the rising winds that threatened to tear the place apart. This was the moment he had been waiting for. In his mind, he could already hear the footsteps of the men that would fall, see the flashes of gunfire and the bloody silhouette of his target, the man who had betrayed Candela. He knew that the truth was simple, one life for another. He had always made that choice before, and he would do it again. The question was whether he would live to see the end of it. As the day dragged on, Horacio observed everything with a calculated patience. He studied the patterns of the guards, the blind spots in their patrols, the vehicles that came and went. And then, just as he had planned, he slipped into the compound's perimeter under the cover of the gathering storm. The rain started to fall in torrents, a natural veil to conceal his movements. The wet ground muffled his footsteps, and the distant rumble of thunder drowned out the sound of the trees swaying above him. He was in, and now there was no turning back. The compound was a fortress of rusted barbed wire, corrugated iron fences, and menacing concrete walls topped with broken glass. But Horacio knew it well. He had helped design structures like these years ago, when he was still a part of the network that ran the dark business between Colombia, Venezuela, and beyond. Now it was a prison, Candela's prison. He moved swiftly through the shadows, stopping only when the faint echo of a voice cut through the storm. It was a guard, calling out to another in the distance. Horacio didn't wait. He pulled his gun from the holster, moving with the precision of a predator, his senses heightened. The guard barely had time to turn before Horacio's bullet slammed into his chest, sending him tumbling backwards. Horacio stepped over the body, his expression cold, indifferent. He had learned long ago that hesitation was a luxury he could no longer afford. He reached the main building in less than an hour. The storm had intensified, the downpour so heavy now that the ground beneath his boots was turning to mud. He could hear the sound of muffled voices coming from inside, the low hum of generators running to power the small compound. Candela was here. He could feel it in his bones, the undeniable pull of her presence, as if she had always been a part of the air he breathed, even after all this time. Horacio took a breath, wiped the rain from his face, and pushed the door open with a soft creak. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from a flickering bulb above. At first, he didn't see her. But then, as his eyes adjusted, he spotted the figure in the corner of the room. She was slumped against the wall, her hands bound with thick rope, her face bruised but still unmistakably hers. Candela. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just relief. It was something deeper, more primal, the recognition of a part of himself that had been buried for too long. And yet, despite the rush of emotions, Horacio kept his composure. He moved toward her slowly, the barrel of his gun still clenched tight in his hand, his eyes scanning the room for any hidden threats. Her eyes snapped open as he approached, her gaze sharp despite the exhaustion and pain etched on her face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The years, the distance, the betrayals, all of it hung between them like an invisible thread, tying them together even after everything had fallen apart. "You came," she whispered, her voice raspy from days of confinement. Her lips curled into a faint, knowing smile, though the joy was clearly tempered by something darker. "I didn't think you would." Horacio crouched beside her, his eyes scanning the room once more before he carefully began to untie the ropes binding her wrists. "I wasn't sure either," he replied quietly, his tone clipped. "But I knew you'd be here. You always were." Candela's smile faltered slightly as she met his gaze. "I thought you were dead," she said softly. "After the raid, after everything. I thought the fire had burned you away." Horacio's fingers paused as he loosened the last knot. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, the memories flooding back like old scars reopening. "Fire doesn't always kill," he muttered, his hands steady as he finally freed her. "Sometimes it just forces you to become something else." Candela didn't respond immediately. She simply stared at him, her eyes calculating, as if she were seeing him for the first time since their last encounter. The man in front of her wasn't the same Horacio she had known, the one who had once offered her his trust only to burn her with it. No, this Horacio was harder, colder. But there was still something that flickered behind his eyes, something she recognized. "I don't know what you've become," she said at last, her voice low. "But I know we don't have much time." Horacio nodded once, standing up and offering her a hand. "You're right. We have to go." They moved quickly through the compound, a silent understanding between them. Candela had always been more than just a partner. She was his mirror, a reflection of his own darkness, the part of him he could never shake. Together, they were an unstoppable force. But even as they approached the exit, Horacio couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that their past had come alive and was now stalking them through the rain-soaked streets. The moment they reached the gates, the first round of gunfire rang out from the watchtowers above. And just like that, the hunt was on. Let's jump to next story. Story 7. South America, 2013. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Andes, casting long shadows across the rough terrain. The air was thick with the stench of burning rubber and diesel, a stark contrast to the pristine beauty of the mountains. In the heart of the dense jungle, the city of El Alto stood as a monument to human ambition, vast, chaotic, and suffocating under its own weight. It was a place where the scent of danger mixed with the scent of raw, unrefined ambition. The city was alive with secrets, some whispered in the corners of its sprawling markets, others shouted on the streets, painted in blood and corruption. In the distance, the steady hum of the local drug cartel's operations could be heard, a constant reminder of the power that ruled this region. Joaquin Vargas, known to those on the streets as El Lobo, had been the cartel's right hand for nearly a decade. But it wasn't the power that held him here. It was the ghosts of his past, the sins he had buried beneath layers of success and violence. He had long since buried any sense of remorse. In his line of work, it was necessary. Emotions were liabilities, weaknesses that could cost you your life. But as he walked through the alleyways of El Alto's seedy underbelly that evening, something gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. He was being watched. His senses, honed by years of navigating the brutal world of drug trade, told him everything he needed to know. His pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the hunt. There were eyes on him, someone was following him, and it wasn't the usual team of bodyguards he kept at a safe distance. This was different. Joaquin's steps slowed as he turned down another narrow alley, his eyes scanning the shadowed corners with practiced precision. The sharp click of a boot heel against the wet cobblestone caught his attention, and without missing a beat, he drew his weapon, a cold, sleek Beretta, from the holster at his side. The gun was an extension of his arm, as familiar as the knife in his boot or the scar across his chest. A figure stepped into view, a tall man with a weathered face and a dark suit, the kind of man who didn't belong in this part of the city, yet walked through it like he owned it. Joaquin's grip on the Beretta tightened as he took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you?" Joaquin's voice was low, steady, his eyes never leaving the man's. The stranger smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm the one who's here to make sure you don't walk out of this alive, Joaquin," he said, his voice smooth, almost pleasant, as if he were delivering a simple business proposition. Joaquin's lips curled into a thin smile, though his mind raced. He had dealt with countless rivals, each one more desperate than the last. This man, however, was different. There was a coolness to him, an air of calculation that set off every alarm in Joaquin's head. This wasn't a street thug or a petty gangster looking for a quick payout. This man was something else entirely. "You've made a mistake, friend," Joaquin replied, his finger lightly brushing the trigger. "I don't die easily." The stranger's grin widened as he took a slow step forward, seemingly unconcerned by the gun pointed at him. "We'll see about that," he said cryptically, before suddenly lunging forward, his hands moving with lightning speed. In that split second, Joaquin knew exactly what kind of fight he was in. It was the kind of fight that didn't involve bullets or bloodshed. Not yet, at least. This was about something far more dangerous: information, power, control. And for Joaquin, it was a fight for his survival in a world where betrayal was a currency as valuable as cocaine. The man moved with eerie precision, disarming Joaquin in a single fluid motion, twisting his arm and sending the Beretta flying from his hand. Joaquin barely had time to react before he was thrown against the cold, damp wall of the alley, his back slamming against the bricks with a sickening thud. For a moment, his vision blurred, the pain shooting through his spine. He gritted his teeth and fought through it, pushing himself off the wall and into a crouch. "I'm not here to kill you, Joaquin," the man said, his tone now completely devoid of warmth. "But you will wish I had." Joaquin's eyes flicked to the discarded Beretta, but he didn't move toward it. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light of the alley. "I don't need a gun to kill you," he growled. The man raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "We'll see. You'll wish for your gun before this is over." And then, without warning, the man lunged again, this time a blur of movement, faster than Joaquin could anticipate. He slashed the air with the knife, aiming for the man's throat, but the stranger was already behind him, his arm locking around Joaquin's neck in a swift, brutal motion. Joaquin felt the pressure building against his throat as he struggled to break free, but the man's grip tightened, and his vision began to fade. In that moment, Joaquin realized the truth. This wasn't just about him. This was bigger than his cartel, bigger than any deal he had ever made. Someone was playing a much larger game, and they weren't interested in his survival. The cartel's empire, built on blood and greed, was crumbling faster than he had anticipated. Whoever this man was, he wasn't here for a quick hit. He was here for the long game. And Joaquin was just one piece of a much darker puzzle. Joaquin's breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled against the man's grip, his mind racing through every scenario he could think of to break free. The air around him felt thick, suffocating, like he was drowning in a sea of his own mistakes. His body tensed, muscles screaming in protest as he fought to stay conscious. For the first time in years, he felt truly vulnerable, like a man on the verge of losing everything. But as the darkness crept closer, something inside of him snapped. A rush of adrenaline coursed through his veins, and with one final surge of strength, he twisted his body, using his legs to kick out and slam the stranger's back against the nearby wall. The grip on his neck loosened for a fraction of a second, but that was all he needed. Joaquin shifted his weight, spinning around and bringing his knee up into the man's stomach with brutal force. The stranger gasped, stumbling backward, but he quickly regained his balance, his cold eyes locking onto Joaquin's with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. For a moment, they stood there, two predators sizing each other up in the dimly lit alley, neither one willing to make the first move. Joaquin's heart hammered in his chest, his mind calculating his next move with lethal precision. He had fought his way out of worse situations, but this felt different. His usual confidence was replaced by something far more dangerous: desperation. He knew that if he didn't get out of this alive, his empire would crumble, and his enemies would seize the opportunity to take him down. But this man wasn't a simple foe. He was a calculated predator, one who knew how to get inside a man's head and make him question everything. The stranger wiped a smear of blood from his lip, his expression unreadable. "You're good, Joaquin," he said, his voice smooth, almost admiring. "But you're not good enough." Before Joaquin could react, the man reached into his coat and pulled out a sleek, black cell phone. He held it up, showing it to Joaquin with a smirk. "I have everything on you," he said coldly. "Every deal, every move you've made, every dirty secret you've buried. Your cartel? I know everything about it." Joaquin's blood ran cold. His mind raced as the gravity of the situation settled over him like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just a random attack. It was a direct strike at everything he had built. The stranger wasn't here to take over his territory or make a quick buck. He was here to destroy him, to expose every sin he had committed and bring everything crashing down around him. "You think you can just destroy me with a phone?" Joaquin spat, his voice thick with venom. He was struggling to keep his composure, but the reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. "You're making a huge mistake." The stranger's smile remained fixed as he turned the phone around, showing Joaquin the screen. It was a recording, a video feed of Joaquin's most secretive meeting, one that had taken place in the dead of night with a known rival. The footage was clear, damning evidence of Joaquin's betrayal, and it was only a matter of time before it was released to the world. Joaquin's stomach twisted as he watched the footage. This wasn't just a few whispers on the street. This was concrete evidence of his corruption, and it was in the hands of a man who had the power to destroy everything in an instant. "Don't you see?" the stranger asked, his voice laced with dark amusement. "I've been watching you for a long time. You and your empire. Your little cartel is nothing more than a tool, a means to an end. I've been orchestrating your downfall from the shadows." Joaquin's anger flared, a dangerous fire rising within him. He had built his empire from nothing, fought tooth and nail to climb to the top, and now, someone was trying to tear it all away in an instant. But Joaquin wasn't ready to go down without a fight. He had come too far, lost too much, to let this stranger, this shadow, take it all away from him. With a sudden movement, Joaquin lunged forward, slamming his fist into the stranger's jaw with all the force he could muster. The man staggered back, momentarily stunned. Joaquin didn't hesitate. He dove for the phone, grabbing it out of the stranger's hand before the man could react. In a flash, Joaquin was on his feet, the phone now in his grip. His eyes locked onto the screen, the video still playing. He could feel the weight of the footage bearing down on him, threatening to crush him under its weight. But there was one thing the stranger had underestimated. Joaquin was not a man who crumbled under pressure. He was a survivor. He always had been. The stranger, recovering from the blow, reached for his gun, but Joaquin was quicker. He raised the phone, smashing it against the pavement with a violent crack, shattering it into pieces. The sound echoed through the alley like a gunshot, signaling the end of one battle. But the war was far from over. The stranger cursed under his breath, his eyes flicking to the shattered remains of the phone. But Joaquin was already moving, closing the distance between them with swift, practiced steps. He reached into his jacket, pulling out the knife he had discarded earlier, and held it up in front of him. The blade gleamed in the fading light, a deadly promise. "You made a mistake," Joaquin said, his voice steady and cold. "You thought you could break me, but you underestimated me." The stranger's expression faltered, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. It was all the opening Joaquin needed. With a swift, decisive motion, he lunged forward, driving the blade into the man's side with brutal precision. The stranger gasped, his eyes wide with shock, but there was no time for words. Joaquin twisted the knife, pulling it free and watching as the man crumpled to the ground in a heap. It was over. For now. Joaquin stood over him, panting, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. He had won this round, but he knew that the war was far from over. His enemies were out there, lurking in the shadows, and this man was only the first of many. But Joaquin had survived another day, and as long as he breathed, he would continue to fight, no matter the cost. As the night closed in around him, Joaquin knew one thing for sure. In this world, only the strongest survive. LTS jumped to next story. Story 8. The humid air of the South American jungle pressed in on Miguel as he trudged through the thick foliage, each step heavy with the weight of what was to come. He had been here before, this place, this feeling, but today felt different. The usual hum of life around him, the cries of birds and rustling of leaves, seemed muted, as though the very earth itself was holding its breath. The bitter taste of sweat mixed with fear lingered on his tongue. He had spent years building an empire in the shadows of the region, a kingdom of illicit trade that stretched across borders, into the hidden corners of the continent. But now it was crumbling piece by piece. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming for him. Miguel had always been careful. Every move he made was calculated, every deal meticulously planned, but even the best-laid plans could unravel in an instant. And the moment he had feared had arrived, a betrayal from within his own ranks. His most trusted lieutenant, a man he had mentored, had turned against him. The information was already leaking, slipping through the cracks of his once impenetrable empire. As he moved deeper into the jungle, the weight of his decision pressed harder on his chest. He was headed for the meeting with the very man who had betrayed him, the man who had once been like a son to him. A man who now held the future of Miguel's entire operation in his hands. A man who had been bought, and in turn, had sold Miguel's empire for a price. But Miguel wasn't one to bow out quietly. He had fought for everything he had, and he would fight to the bitter end to protect what remained. The rendezvous was set for the old airstrip, a forgotten place where the world had turned its back. Few knew about it, and even fewer came here anymore. It was perfect, a place where secrets could be buried, and bodies could be left to rot without anyone asking questions. Miguel's boots crunched on the gravel as he neared the edge of the airstrip, where a rusted Cessna sat, its once pristine wings now weathered and scarred by years of neglect. His heart beat faster as he spotted the silhouette of his lieutenant, Carlos, standing near the plane waiting. The air around them seemed to still, the tension palpable. Carlos turned as Miguel approached, a smirk on his face that made Miguel's blood boil. The man was so young, so full of ambition. But it was that very ambition that had driven him to this point. Miguel had taken him under his wing, shown him the ropes, and in return, Carlos had sold his loyalty to the highest bidder. Now, everything Miguel had worked for was at risk. "You came," Carlos said, his voice cool, almost too calm for the situation. His eyes flickered over Miguel's form, studying him with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "I wasn't sure you would. I figured you'd run, hide like a coward." Miguel's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not running from anything, Carlos. I've spent my life building this empire, and I'll die protecting it." Carlos laughed, a hollow sound that echoed through the airstrip. "Protect it? It's already over, Miguel. You're too old, too slow. The game has changed. The world has changed. And I'm the one who's going to lead it now." Miguel's eyes narrowed. He knew what Carlos was trying to do. Provoke him, get him angry, make him lose control. But Miguel wasn't foolish. He had dealt with worse men than Carlos, men who would have killed him without a second thought. But Miguel had survived. And he wasn't about to die today, not without a fight. "I didn't raise you to turn on me," Miguel said, his voice low and dangerous. "I didn't teach you this life just so you could tear it down." Carlos shrugged, his hands slipping into his pockets. "You were never a father to me. You were a means to an end. I used you just as much as you used me. But now, I don't need you anymore. I have my own network, my own people. And you're just a relic of the past." The words hit Miguel like a slap to the face. The betrayal stung more than he had expected. But it also fueled something darker inside him, something that had been buried beneath years of calculated decisions and cold, hard business. The rage inside him began to build, surging like a storm that had been gathering for far too long. "I warned you," Miguel said, his voice now steady with the weight of finality. "You've made a mistake, and mistakes in this business don't go unpunished." Carlos stepped back, a look of confusion crossing his face for the briefest of moments. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone suddenly wary. Miguel didn't answer. He reached into his jacket, his fingers closing around the cold steel of his gun. He had been carrying it for years, hidden beneath the layers of his carefully constructed life. It was the last thing he had left to control, and now, in this moment, it was the only thing that mattered. Before Carlos could react, Miguel pulled the gun from his jacket and aimed it directly at his former lieutenant's chest. The younger man's eyes widened, his smirk faltering as the gravity of the situation sank in. He hadn't expected this. He had thought Miguel was just a shadow of his former self, someone whose power had waned with age. But Miguel had never been weaker. He had only been biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "You should have stayed loyal," Miguel said, his voice cold as ice. "But now you've sealed your fate." Carlos's hands shot up, the terror finally breaking through the facade of bravado. But it was too late. Miguel squeezed the trigger, the sound of the shot ringing through the air like a death knell. Carlos crumpled to the ground, his body twitching once before going still. Miguel stood over him for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest, but his face betrayed no emotion. The deed was done. His empire would remain intact, for now. But as he turned to walk away, the faint sound of a plane's engines hummed in the distance. The game was far from over. Miguel knew that Carlos wasn't the only threat he faced. There were others out there, hungry for power, ready to take what was his. And Miguel would do whatever it took to make sure that didn't happen. Miguel walked away from the lifeless body of Carlos, the sound of his footsteps lost in the vast expanse of the jungle. His mind raced, but his face remained impassive, as though the coldness of the moment had seeped into his bones. There was no time to linger, no time to mourn what had happened or reflect on what he had just done. He had no illusions about the price of betrayal. It was always steep, and this time it had been paid in blood. The jungle around him felt suffocating, the thick canopy above blocking out much of the sunlight. Shadows stretched long and menacing across the ground, as if nature itself conspired to conceal the sins of men. Miguel knew the darkness well. He had spent too many years in it, building his criminal empire, manipulating governments, and controlling vast swaths of territory with an iron fist. But now, with Carlos dead and his empire crumbling, he found himself in the thickest part of the darkness yet. Every corner, every whisper in the air, seemed like a threat waiting to materialize. Miguel moved swiftly, his hand instinctively reaching for the old walkie-talkie that hung from his belt. It crackled to life, the static barely covering the voice of his trusted right-hand man, Javier. "Miguel, is everything all right?" Javier's voice was tense, barely masking the worry. It was understandable. Javier had known Miguel long enough to understand the implications of what had just happened. "Everything's fine," Miguel replied, his voice smooth, betraying none of the turmoil that churned inside him. "Carlos won't be a problem anymore." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Javier spoke again, this time with a note of caution. "What about the rest of them? The ones who've been feeding him information? The ones who were in on it?" Miguel's grip tightened around the walkie-talkie. He had known this question was coming. He had anticipated it, but that didn't make the answer any easier. "We'll handle them," he said, his voice firm. "I'll take care of it." The air around him seemed to grow thicker, heavier. Miguel had always been a man of action, a man who never hesitated when it came to eliminating threats. But the weight of the situation now felt different, more oppressive. The empire he had built on blood and deceit was beginning to unravel, and he could feel it in his bones. He paused in his tracks, a shadow crossing his face as he considered the path ahead. What was he really protecting now? The business? The money? The people who had come to rely on him? Or had he become something else entirely? Something far more dangerous and more desperate? Miguel's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden roar of an engine. He looked up sharply, his instincts kicking in. The sound of the plane's engines grew louder, growing closer. His pulse quickened, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it just a coincidence? Or had someone caught wind of what had happened? The plane appeared over the treetops, its silhouette cutting a sharp contrast against the fading light of the afternoon. It was small, too small to carry much in the way of cargo or passengers, just the kind of plane used for quick, covert deliveries. Miguel's eyes narrowed. The airstrip, though abandoned by most, was still a hub for those with less than legal business. If Carlos had been working with someone else, someone outside of the immediate circle, this could be the moment when everything fell apart. The plane circled above, its engines rumbling as it descended toward the clearing. Miguel knew that if it was anyone other than his men, they were about to have a serious problem on their hands. His instincts, honed over years of evading law enforcement and rival gangs, told him to act fast. Miguel ducked into the undergrowth, his movements swift and silent. He crouched low, his breath shallow, as he watched the plane land, its wheels skimming the dusty runway. The propellers slowly wound down as the plane came to a stop. A figure emerged from the plane, a tall, lean man in a dark suit, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Miguel's heart skipped a beat. He didn't recognize him, but the man's presence alone told him everything he needed to know. This was someone important, someone with connections outside of their usual network. The man paused, glancing around the airstrip with an air of detached indifference. He then began walking toward the old hangar where Carlos had met his end. Miguel's grip on his gun tightened. He wasn't going to let this man get close to what was left of his empire. Not now. Not after everything he had done to keep it intact. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp voice from behind him. "Boss, we've got a problem." Javier's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie again, more urgent this time. "What is it?" Miguel asked, his voice low, steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "It's the police," Javier replied, a note of panic creeping into his tone. "They've surrounded the perimeter. They're closing in." Miguel felt his stomach tighten. The situation was slipping out of his control faster than he could manage. They had to act, and fast. The police closing in meant only one thing: the end of the line for everything Miguel had fought for. He couldn't afford to lose his footing now. "Get the men in position," Miguel barked. "We need to get out of here now." As Miguel moved, he cast one last glance at the figure by the plane. Whoever he was, whatever his purpose, Miguel had no intention of letting him interfere. His empire would survive, even if it meant burning everything to the ground. Let's jump to next story. Story 9. South America, 2011. The moon hung low over the jungle, casting eerie shadows that danced across the dusty roads and hidden paths beneath the thick canopy. Santiago Ruiz wasn't one to be intimidated by the darkness. He had spent his life in the shadows, building an empire from the ground up, shaping it with his hands like a sculptor working on a statue that only he could see. The jungle had always been his ally, a place to hide, to move without being seen, and tonight, it was his battlefield. But even in the stillness of the night, Santiago could feel the air shift, the heavy silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a jaguar, and the far-off rumble of the river that twisted like a serpent through the land. It had been a long time since Santiago had felt fear, but tonight, something was different. A sense of urgency had seized him, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. The shipment that was supposed to arrive in the early hours of the morning was delayed, and Santiago was beginning to sense that something wasn't right. He trusted few people, and even fewer people trusted him. The arrangement had been clear. The weapons would arrive at dawn, ready for the next phase of his operation. A simple deal, one that would secure his place at the top of the South American criminal underworld. But now, with the night stretching on and no word from his men, Santiago's patience was wearing thin. He paced back and forth beneath the shelter of the makeshift tent, his boots crunching against the gravel beneath him. His hand clenched around the handle of his revolver, the cold metal reassuring in its weight. He wasn't a man who liked to be kept waiting. And tonight, with everything on the line, waiting could mean his downfall. Santiago had worked too hard for too long to lose it all now. Not to some misplaced shipment or some careless mistake. "Something's wrong," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely more than a growl. His mind was racing through the possibilities, each one darker than the last. What if the authorities had caught wind of the operation? What if one of his men had turned traitor? He couldn't afford the luxury of second-guessing himself. Time was running out. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Santiago's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, his fingers tightening on the grip. The figure that emerged from the shadows was familiar, a hulking presence that loomed large even in the dim light. It was Juan, one of his most trusted enforcers, but there was something about his posture that set Santiago's nerves on edge. Juan was never this quiet, never this tense. "You've heard from them?" Santiago asked, his voice cool despite the simmering anger in his chest. Juan shook his head slowly, his eyes darting nervously to the trees that surrounded them. "Nothing yet, Chief. The others are still out there, but they haven't made contact." Santiago cursed under his breath. "This is taking too long. We can't afford to wait any longer. If we don't have those guns by morning, the whole deal falls apart. You know what that means." One shifted uneasily. "I know, Chief, but something doesn't feel right. It's like they disappeared into thin air." Santiago's mind raced as he processed the information. The shipment wasn't just delayed, it had vanished. And that could only mean one thing. Someone had sabotaged the deal. He turned on Juan, his eyes narrowing with fury. "What do you mean, vanished? How the hell does a shipment of this size just disappear? Tell me, Juan, what do you know?" Juan took a step back, his face paling in the moonlight. "We've been hearing rumors, Chief. About the police, about rival gangs. They say there's been movement along the river. People are talking, and some of our own men have started getting cold feet." Santiago clenched his jaw, trying to keep his cool. If anyone knew how to handle a situation like this, it was him. But this felt different. The weight of the jungle around him seemed to close in, suffocating him with the knowledge that whatever was happening, he couldn't stop it with brute force alone. "I don't care about rumors, Juan. I care about the deal. Get me the guns, or I'll make sure every man who's behind this pays." Juan hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously to the shadows. "We might have a bigger problem, Chief. There's word of a group of mercenaries in the area, working for a rival syndicate. They've been making their way up the river, and they might have intercepted the shipment." Santiago's stomach churned. The mercenaries were no ordinary threat. They were killers, trained professionals who worked for the highest bidder, no questions asked. If they had taken the shipment, they could ruin everything he had worked for. "Where are they now?" Santiago demanded, his voice low and lethal. Juan's eyes shifted toward the distant tree-line. "We don't know, Chief, but we've tracked them to a village about 20 miles south. They're setting up camp there." Santiago's mind was already calculating the next steps, his instincts taking over. He knew the river better than anyone, knew the villages, the routes, the hidden trails that could be used to evade pursuit. He had dealt with rivals before, mercenaries, politicians, corrupt officials, and he always came out on top. But this time, the stakes were higher. If he failed, he wouldn't just lose a shipment. He would lose everything. I want you to gather the men. We're going to that village, Santiago ordered. We'll hit them hard, fast, and leave no trace. This ends tonight. Juan nodded, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. Santiago could see the fear in his enforcer's face, the weight of the unknown pressing on him. But there was no room for hesitation now. Santiago had never let fear control him, and tonight, he wasn't about to start. As he moved toward the edge of the camp, his mind already turning over the next steps, Santiago felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. The jungle was vast, and the darkness of the night would conceal their every move. But even in the cover of darkness, Santiago knew one thing for sure. No one could escape the wrath of his empire, and tonight, he was going to remind them of that. The jungle was alive with the sounds of creatures moving through the underbrush, the occasional cry of a distant bird, and the wind that rustled through the thick foliage. Santiago and his men moved swiftly through the darkness, their footsteps silent, their bodies hidden by the dense vegetation. The path ahead was narrow, winding, and treacherous, just the way Santiago liked it. There was no room for error tonight. The stakes were too high. The mercenaries had made a grave mistake by crossing him, and they would pay the price. As they neared the village, Santiago's mind raced with calculations. He knew the mercenaries' tactics. They would have set up an ambush, fortified their position, and probably had guards posted at every possible route. But Santiago had anticipated this. He had learned over the years that in the world of crime, the element of surprise was often the most powerful weapon. They wouldn't see him coming. Juan and the other enforcers moved ahead, their bodies tense with anticipation, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. Santiago stayed a few paces behind, his hand resting on the revolver at his side, ready to strike at the first sign of trouble. The village loomed ahead, a collection of thatched huts surrounded by the thick jungle, with no lights to be seen and no sounds but the occasional crackle of the fire from a distant camp. It was eerily quiet, and that made Santiago even more cautious. They reached the outskirts of the village without incident, the moonlight filtering through the leaves and casting faint shadows on the ground. The village was smaller than he had imagined, a few dozen huts, a small clearing in the center. The mercenaries had chosen well. It was remote, isolated, the perfect spot to lay low. But it was also vulnerable. Santiago knew the terrain too well. There was a narrow path leading from the river that was perfect for a quick escape, but it would also be their undoing if they tried to run. Santiago had anticipated every move. He always did. Juan, his most trusted enforcer, signaled to him from the front, his finger held up to his lips in a silent command. Santiago moved forward, the men falling into position around him, forming a loose perimeter around the village. There was no time to waste. The mercenaries had to be eliminated swiftly, with no survivors to leak information. Santiago had always been ruthless when it came to protecting his interests. The plan was simple. They would breach the village from three sides, cutting off any escape routes and overwhelming the mercenaries before they could react. Santiago gave a brief nod to Juan, and within seconds, the men moved into position, their movements swift and deliberate. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. They were professionals, trained for this. Santiago's heart was pounding, the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he prepared for the confrontation. He had been in countless firefights before, had seen blood spilled, had heard the screams of men who thought they were untouchable. But this felt different. This wasn't just about a shipment of weapons. This was personal. The mercenaries had crossed a line, and Santiago wasn't going to let them get away with it. The jungle was his domain, and anyone who dared to challenge him would learn the hard way. They breached the village under cover of darkness, moving fast and silently, taking out the sentries before they could raise the alarm. Santiago's revolver was out, the cold metal in his hand feeling like an extension of his arm. He moved with precision, his eyes locked on the target, his mind focused on the mission. One by one, the mercenaries fell, their bodies crumpling to the ground without a sound. The silence of the night was broken only by the faint crackle of leaves underfoot and the occasional muffled grunt of a man falling in battle. The villagers, caught in the crossfire, huddled in their homes, terrified by the sudden onslaught of violence. But Santiago didn't care about them. His men were efficient, deadly, and precise. Every shot counted. The mercenaries had no chance. Santiago moved through the village, his senses heightened, every muscle in his body attuned to the rhythm of the operation. He knew the layout of the village by heart, knew the places where the mercenaries might try to hide or regroup. His eyes were sharp, scanning every corner, every shadow. The village was smaller than he had imagined, but it was still a maze, a place where danger could lurk behind every hut. One appeared at his side, his face grim. "Jeef, they're cornered in the main hut. We've got them surrounded." Santiago's lips curled into a thin smile. "Good. Let's finish this." The two men moved toward the center of the village, where the largest hut stood, a simple structure made of wood and thatch. The mercenaries were inside, and they had nowhere to run. Santiago could feel the tension building in the air, could hear the muffled voices from inside the hut. It was now or never. He motioned for his men to fan out, and then, without another word, he kicked in the door. The room was dark, and for a moment, all Santiago could see were silhouettes of men scrambling to draw their weapons. But it was too late. Santiago's gun was already raised, and the first mercenary fell, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. The others reacted too slowly, and within moments, the room was filled with the sound of gunfire, the air thick with the acrid smell of smoke and blood. The mercenaries fought back, but they were outmatched, overwhelmed by the speed and precision of Santiago's men. When the last shot rang out, the village fell into silence once more. The jungle resumed its rhythm, the distant sounds of wildlife returning as the gunfire subsided. Santiago stood in the center of the hut, his chest heaving, his heart still racing from the adrenaline. His men moved around him, checking the bodies, securing the area. The shipment was safe, but Santiago knew that this was just the beginning. There would always be another threat, another rival, another obstacle to overcome. But for now, he had won. He wiped the sweat from his brow, the weight of the victory settling over him. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice calm, his face betraying no emotion. The operation was complete, but the war was far from over. The jungle was still his, and as long as he was in charge, no one would take it from him. Santiago Ruiz walked into the night, the jungle closing around him once more, his empire intact, for now. Let's jump to next story. Story 10. South America, 2010. The humid air of the South American night clung to Julio's skin like a second layer, the scent of damp earth mingling with the metallic tang of sweat. He had been in this part of the world long enough to know that the city's underworld was as unpredictable as it was unforgiving. As a hired hand, a fixer, he had worked with the finest criminals and the most ruthless criminals alike. But tonight was different. This wasn't a typical job. This wasn't about cash transfers or drug deals. No, tonight was about power. Julio stood outside a small, unassuming bar in the heart of Buenos Aires. The neon lights buzzed faintly above him, casting an eerie glow on the cracked sidewalk. He adjusted the collar of his jacket, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He had been instructed to meet someone here, someone whose reputation preceded him in ways that made even Julio feel uneasy. The man's name was Alejandro Vargas, and his rise in the city's criminal hierarchy was meteoric, fueled by ruthless ambition and a series of violent takedowns that had left more than one rival dead in the streets. Julio lit a cigarette, the glow briefly illuminating his hardened face. He didn't know what exactly Vargas wanted with him, but he knew enough to understand that it wouldn't be good. In this world, favors were rarely free. If Alejandro Vargas was calling on him, it meant he had a job, one that required discretion and most likely blood. As he took a drag from his cigarette, Julio's mind wandered back to the earlier days of his involvement in the city's criminal underworld. He had started out small, working as a runner for a low-tier drug dealer, carrying packages across the border, and making barely enough to keep himself afloat. Over the years, though, Julio had learned how to navigate the politics of power in Buenos Aires. He had learned how to keep his head down, how to watch and listen, how to strike when the time was right. And it had served him well. He had survived longer than most. But this job with Vargas felt different. Too many players were involved, and Julio knew that even the slightest misstep could mean the end of his career, and possibly his life. A figure emerged from the shadows, cutting through the dimly lit street like a specter. Julio didn't have to look twice to know it was Vargas. The man's imposing presence made the air feel thicker, heavier, as if the very weight of his influence pressed down on everything around him. Alejandro Vargas had the kind of reputation that made people tremble at the mere mention of his name. He was the type of man who didn't just take what he wanted, he annihilated anyone who stood in his way. "Julio," Vargas's voice was low, almost a growl, as he came to a stop in front of him. "We need to talk." Julio flicked the cigarette, but to the ground, crushing it beneath his boot. "I'm listening." Vargas didn't waste time with pleasantries. "There's a shipment coming through the port tomorrow. I need someone reliable to handle it. You'll meet a contact at the docks at midnight. They'll have the package, and you'll bring it back to me." Julio raised an eyebrow. It sounded simple enough, but he knew better than to trust any job that came from Vargas. There was always a hidden catch, always a deeper layer to unravel. "What's the catch?" Julio asked, his voice steady. Vargas's lips curled into a half-smile, but there was no humor in his eyes. "The shipment is valuable. More valuable than you can imagine. There are others who want it. You'll have to make sure it reaches me without incident. And I don't have to tell you what happens if it doesn't." Julio nodded, his instincts sharpening. The job felt like a test, a way for Vargas to gauge his loyalty, his ability to handle high-stakes situations. Julio wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, but something about this felt off. There was a tension in the air, a sense of impending danger that seemed to suffocate the very atmosphere around them. He had no choice but to accept the job, though. Turning down Vargas wasn't an option. "I'll do it," Julio said, his voice firm. Vargas's gaze lingered on him for a moment, as if sizing him up. "Good," he finally said. "But remember, Julio, failure is not an option. There are eyes everywhere. One slip, and you'll find yourself at the bottom of the river with the others who thought they could cross me." Julio didn't flinch. He had heard the rumors, the whispers about those who had crossed Vargas. They were always found, always dealt with, and he had no intention of becoming another name on that list. "I understand," Julio replied, his voice cold. Vargas nodded and turned, disappearing back into the shadows from which he had come. Julio stood there for a moment, his mind racing. The night was quiet now, the sounds of the city carrying on as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Julio was about to embark on a dangerous path, and there was no turning back. He had accepted the job, and now he had to see it through. His reputation, his life, and his future depended on it. With a final glance at the bar, Julio turned and made his way down the street, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. The docks awaited him, and with them, the shadow of Alejandro Vargas. The clock was ticking. The streets of Buenos Aires, usually alive with the hum of traffic and the chatter of pedestrians, seemed eerily quiet as Julio made his way toward the docks. The air, thick with the smell of salt water and old oil, carried the sense of impending trouble. Every step he took felt heavier, his boots scraping against the cracked pavement with a sense of finality. He had accepted the job, but now that he was on the way, doubts crept into his mind. Was this really just a simple exchange of goods? Or was there something far darker lying beneath the surface? Julio had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and his gut told him that Vargas was playing a game, one with stakes higher than he was ready to handle. The docks were a labyrinth of rusted containers, abandoned warehouses, and flickering streetlights that barely pierced the night's darkness. Julio's eyes darted around as he walked, every shadow seeming to hide a threat. He knew the area well, had worked here before, running small shipments for lesser players. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he wasn't just another cog in the machine. Tonight, he was stepping into a world of power and betrayal, and he had no idea who would walk away from it unscathed. He reached the designated warehouse, its large steel door creaking in the wind as he approached. The only light came from a flickering lamp above the door, casting long shadows across the ground. Julio took a deep breath, pushing open the door with a low groan. Inside, the space was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of oil and decay. He could make out the silhouettes of several men standing by a large crate in the far corner of the room. "Julio," one of them called out, his voice sharp and commanding. "You're late." Julio stepped inside, his eyes narrowing as he took in the men before him. They weren't the usual smugglers he was accustomed to. These were the kind of men who carried power in their eyes. Their presence alone told him that they were Vargas's people, not the kind of men who took kindly to mistakes. "I had business to handle," Julio replied coolly, his voice betraying none of the tension coiling inside him. "Is the package here?" The man who had spoken before gestured to the crate in the corner, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Right where it should be. But remember, Julio, you're not just picking up a shipment. You're picking up a responsibility." Julio's gaze shifted to the crate, and his stomach tightened. He knew that whatever was inside had to be important. Vargas had made it clear that this wasn't just a run-of-the-mill job. This was a test of loyalty, and one slip could cost him everything. He approached the crate slowly, his hand hovering over the lock. One of the men stepped forward, holding up a set of keys. "Here," he said, tossing them toward Julio. "You know what to do." Julio caught the keys with ease and unlocked the crate. The lid creaked open, revealing the contents inside. The glow from the lamp illuminated the object, wrapped in heavy plastic and secured with several layers of tape. The sight of it sent a chill down his spine. He hadn't expected it to be this serious. This wasn't just any shipment, it was something far more valuable. Something that would make any sane man rethink his next move. "Everything looks good," Julio muttered, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. But his hand lingered over the package. Something didn't sit right. There was a strange feeling of danger in the air, a warning that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the item that was worth millions. It was the people who wanted it, and the lengths they'd go to get it. The door slammed open, and Julio spun around, his instincts kicking into overdrive. A group of men, faces obscured by dark masks, rushed into the room, weapons drawn. Their steps were synchronized, their movements fluid, a team. A well-trained team. "Get down," one of the masked men shouted, and before Julio could react, a bullet whizzed past his ear, embedding itself into the wall behind him. The men who had been with Julio immediately reached for their guns, but the attackers were faster, overwhelming them with brutal efficiency. Julio dove behind a stack of crates, his heart pounding in his chest as the gunfire erupted around him. The air was thick with tension, the sounds of shuffling feet and distant screams filling the room. He cursed under his breath. He had been set up. Vargas had known this would happen. The shipment wasn't just valuable, it was a trap, and Julio had walked right into it. As the gunfire died down, Julio peeked around the crate, assessing the situation. 3 of Vargas's men were dead, and the rest were either injured or scrambling for cover. The attackers hadn't taken the package yet, but it was clear they were here for one thing, and one thing only. They wanted it, and they would stop at nothing to get it. Julio's mind raced. There was no time to play the hero. He had to get out, and he had to get the package back to Vargas before the entire operation crumbled. He grabbed the package, his fingers trembling, and looked for a way out. But as he sprinted toward the back door, the masked men closed in, blocking his escape. "You think you can walk away with this?" one of them taunted, his voice cold and menacing. Julio didn't answer. Instead, he made a split-second decision. He dove to the ground, rolling to the side just as the attackers fired. The bullets missed by inches, but Julio was already on his feet again, sprinting toward the narrow alley that led to the back streets of the city. He didn't look back. There was no time to dwell on the bloodshed or the shattered lives. Julio knew that in the world he lived in, this was just another day, another job, another fight for survival. But as he ran, the weight of the package in his hands felt heavier than ever.